In the year of 1820, there were roughly 123,000 people living throughout New York City. At the time, the population group of New York was composed of mostly native-born Americans, who mostly identified as Protestant Christians. The once major ethnic division between citizens of both the English and Dutch ancestry had subsided by this point in history. Also at the time, New York was a peaceful city that lacked any major crime, even so much so that New York didn't even have their own official police forces, mostly operated under local neighborhood watches. However, this time period of a peaceful New York would forever change in 1825 with the opening of the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is a massive waterway that connects all the way through New York, and through the opening of the Erie Canal, New York became a central hub for the transportation of goods. Cheap labor was used to help build the Erie Canal, with many labor jobs being filled by the multitude of immigrants entering the United States through New York. The city grew extremely fast, with the city lacking proper planning to accommodate this massive influx of population. Apartment tracts sprung up on the streets, lacking both sewers and safe drinking water. With not enough physical capacity, there were also drastic overcrowded living conditions, which helped spread both medical and criminal outbreaks. Within the 1820s, the biggest group of immigrants to arrive in New York were the Irish. The Irish immigrants, who were mostly poor and Catholic Christian, were America's first urban ethnic group. In an effort to maintain their ethnic background, the Irish opened their own stores, known as green grocery speakeasies, which they formed in their own ghetto neighborhood, known as the Five Points. It would be in this neighborhood that the first official gangs of the United States would be formed. This neighborhood was an area located in the Paradise Square district, where five streets once intersected. Much of the previously mentioned deteriorating conditions of New York was especially prevalent in the Five Points, as it was seen as one of New York's worst slums. Apart from just preserving their ethnic backgrounds, the Irish also opened their green grocery speakeasies as alternatives for traditional shopping markets that were often too expensive for Irish men and women. Unfortunately, however, the cheaper option also reflected in its quality, with many of the meats and fruits sold either being partially or fully rotten. These green grocery speakeasies, however, also provided a disguise for a building to house illegal activities in their back rooms, with the first of these speakeasies being created by a woman named Rosanna Piers. Rosanna would draw out customers into her back room by offering cheap homemade liquor. Not too long into her store's creation, a variety of different criminals would begin to occupy her store. Among these criminals were the members of New York's first official street gang of America, which were known as the 40 Thieves. With the gang's creation came Rosanna Piers, creating the back room of her store into the headquarters of the 40 Thieves, being led by a man named Edward Coleman. The 40 Thieves would dominate the Five Points district for over a decade, until 1856, when Coleman had been arrested for murdering his wife. This first official gang of the United States being formed and how they were formed gave birth to rivaling gangs being created in other back rooms of other green grocery stores. Many of the fellow first official gangs of America and New York would be the Chichesters, the Roach Guards, the Plug Uglies, the Shirt Tails, and the Dead Rabbits. Let's take, for example, the Roach Guards and the Dead Rabbits. The Roach Guards were formed as a protective gang meant to protect the liquor sellers of the Five Points. One evening during a meeting of the Roach Guards, a member of a dissident faction from within the gang threw a dead rabbit into the crowd. Why this was significant is because within Irish culture, a dead rabbit is a sign to be fearful of a man. This dissident faction would leave the Roach Guards and form their own gang called the Dead Rabbits, making both of these gangs sworn rivals. Let's talk about an area north of the Five Points, known as the Bowery. Here in the Bowery, many young men would work as butchers, which also presented an area where many of these young men would also fall into the gang world. One of the most prominent gangs within the Bowery were the Bowery Boys, who would often battle against the Dead Rabbits. Battles between the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits were intense, lasting days on end and using physical objects such as bricks, knives, and bats. Women that were supporting both gangs assisted by standing by to tend to their injuries, supplying weapons, or sometimes even joining in on the fight themselves. One of the most famous Irish women gangsters who fought alongside the Dead Rabbits was Hellcat Maggie. Maggie would hone her teeth razor sharp, using it as a weapon to fiercely bite her opponents, as well as wearing artificial fingernails made of brass to inflict deep scratching pain. These battles between early street gangs in the Bowery were extremely intense, so intensive that the little law enforcement presence New York had was not enough. Not only was this not enough, but even the National Guard themselves being sent in was still not enough, demanding that the regular army themselves had to be sent in to stop the violence. With New York now losing its sense of a peace haven, this would gradually take the attention of residents who lived there, with newspapers now beginning to change their focus on reporting crime and the rise of street gangs. By 1840, the population of New York had risen to 300,000 people. By this point, New York had now gone through an immense social change with crime taking over, in large part due to the gangs that had established themselves throughout the area starting in the 1820s. It was also during this time that the social phenomenon of street gangs had begun to expand outside of New York and into other major United States cities and states. Take, for example, the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, which had an approximated number of 100 street gangs between the 1840s and 1870s. With such a growing presence of gangs, as well as civil disobedience riots, citizens demanded a more effective system of law and order that went beyond their current system at the time, which mostly composed of day and night watch systems. These day and night watch systems were deemed ineffective to combat the growing presence of crime, with criticisms ranging. Such criticisms included the fact that most of the watchmen were only ordinary citizens that would demonstrate very erratic and inefficient behavior. With industrialization, modernity, a longer lifespan, and democratic societies, came the idea that citizens should have certain basic rights. One of these important rights included granting citizens certain protections under governmental supervision, such as the right to own property, free from the threat that others may take or destroy it. Professional governmental law enforcement stepped to serve this function. This function was served, with New Yorkers looking to London and their police system as the solution. The first professional police force was London's Metropolitan Police Force, created in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel. 16 years later, New York would follow suit, creating America's very first police force in 1845. Other American cities would follow New York's direction and establish their own police forces, with official establishments being in every major American city by the mid-1860s, and even some smaller American cities having their own police forces. The gangs were not intimidated by the early New York police forces, attacking them with fierce intensity. For Irish gangs, much of their attacks toward the police was motivated on a personal level, reflecting much of the cultural baggage from their struggles in Ireland and England. This was especially true due to the uniforms of the early New York police force, which attempted to look like the uniforms of London's Metropolitan Police Force. The English and the Irish historically have had a lot of negative history with one another, particularly due to the Great Irish Potato Famine, which was amplified in a great deal due to the English. In 1850, the population of New York City had exceeded over 500,000 people, with an estimated 30,000 of this population belonging to gang members. During the mid to late 1800s, street gangs directly influenced the result of New York's political elections. Political institutions such as Tammany Hall used gangs to influence elections. These gangs would influence political elections by scaring away citizens from voting polls in return for favors by these politicians. These favors would range, but mostly consisted of providing these gangs with safe meet-out locations, allowing the gangs to gather in locations bought and owned by the politicians, as well as catering to the gangs with vices, such as providing them with alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. In turn, the politician had bought themselves muscle power as they sought re-elections. A good example of one of these corrupt politicians was Fernando Wood. Born in 1812, Fernando Wood came to New York from Philadelphia with his family, where he went into the liquor and cigar business as a young man. Fernando was elected to Congress in 1840, majorly through the support of Tammany Hall. After attempting to run for New York mayor in 1850 and losing, Fernando chose to utilize corruption to win his next election. Using corruption of gangs and even the police in the 1852 primary, gangs had taken ballot boxes and not allowed entrance to the polls, while the police stood by and did nothing. Control of the police was estimated to be worth as many as 10,000 votes in a mayoral election at a time when fewer than 100,000 votes were cast. While earlier mayors had attempted to preserve a degree of legitimacy in their use of political power, Fernando Wood made little effort to conceal his willingness to run city government for his own benefit and that of his Tammany Hall allies. The corruption and politicization of Wood's administration directly contributed to the creation of rival police forces and prompted intervention by the New York State government. Amid this breakdown of authority, local street gangs thrived, capitalizing on the chaos and the growing influence they held within the city's political and social landscape. Focusing off New York City, let's see what was going on during this time period regarding gang activity in other major United States cities as well, such as New Orleans, Baltimore, and Richmond. Within Baltimore, massive migration came to the city, with most of this mass migration coming from the Irish, similarly to New York, as well as German immigrants as well. Between the years of 1830 to 1860, their numbers pushed Baltimore's population from 80,000 to roughly 212,000. Many of these Baltimore gangs included gangs such as the Rip Raps, the American Rattlers, and the Blood Tubs. Like the immigrants from the Northeast, many of these immigrants were poor and Catholic. Just as similarly to the New York gangs, Baltimore gangs also used their force to influence local elections, such as many of them actually traveling to Philadelphia in the mid-1850s to disrupt their local elections. As this was occurring, native-born Baltimore gangs, as well as native-born New Orleans gangs, fought against immigrant Irish and German gangs, as well as the newly formed police force of these cities. Beyond just expanding their attempts to influence Philadelphia's local elections, naturally Baltimore gangs used their influence to affect their own local elections as well. It's been described that these gangs were being used to maintain hegemony in voting patterns, and that a pattern of quid pro quo was formed between gangs and politicians. Such efforts to maintain hegemony from those native-born Baltimore gangs included many different intimidation acts. An example of such intimidation acts included immigrants being kidnapped by native gangs and being kept in sheds, where they would often be held, and often made to drink large amounts of alcohol, and then beaten and robbed. They would then be transported on Election Day, where these immigrants would cast votes in favor of who these native gangs had told them to support. Let's touch very briefly about the gang activity in Richmond, Virginia. There were over 30 documented gangs in Richmond during the mid-1800s, which consisted of mostly white upper-middle-class boys who had plenty of free time to do so. As immigrants began to settle in Richmond, their youth would form gangs, which in turn caused the native gangs of Richmond to fight against those new immigrant gangs. Let's begin to move toward the late 1800s. Beginning from the earlier 1800s, the Irish had been the prominent group to dominate the American gang world. But by the late 1800s, their status as new immigrants had mostly subsided, with many of them now being integrated and assimilated into American culture. This status had begun to change for various reasons. For one, the Irish, as decades went on, slowly began to change their economic status in America, with many of them by the late 1800s dominating the police force, having gained much more political power through institutions such as the previously mentioned Tammany Hall in New York, as well as building a much stronger kinship with native-born Americans as they fought alongside them in the Civil War. With the Irish having now been seen as assimilated into America, came a new wave of immigrants into New York. By 1910, New York City's population had risen to over 2 million people. Like the Irish, these new immigrants had faced very similar conditions to them in the 1800s, with many of them also forming ethnic street gangs, looking to seek out an area of New York to congregate for themselves. Now moving on to the early 1900s, Let's talk about these new immigrant groups, replacing the Irish in terms of emerging gang activity, which were composed of primarily Jewish and Italian gangs. The Eastmans, a gang comprised of mostly Jewish people, formed east of the Bowery, which was led by a man named Monk Eastman. The Eastmans' primary rival was the Five Points Gang, a gang comprised of mostly Italians, not to be confused with the same name given to the previously mentioned Irish slum, also known as the Five Points. This gang resided to the west of the Bowery. The Eastmans and the Five Points would often wage battles against each other, making them fierce rivals. The Five Points' leadership was under Italian immigrant Paolo Vaccarelli, also known as Paul Kelly, with his second-in-command Johnny Torrio. This gang would be extremely influential in the crime world, as Torrio would later become a valuable member of the Sicilian Mafia. On top of this, another member of the Five Points gang would later become arguably the most notorious mob boss of all time, which was Al Capone. In the early 1900s, New York City's garment industry was dominated by Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. They worked as tailors, seamstresses, cutters, and pressers, often in overcrowded sweatshops with long hours and dangerous conditions. Out of this environment emerged some of the most powerful labor movements in American history. Jewish garment workers were at the forefront of unionization, organizing massive strikes to demand higher wages, shorter hours, and safer workplaces. But these labor battles quickly turned violent. Some garment manufacturers responded by hiring gangsters to intimidate picketers, break strikes, and protect strikebreakers. This practice, known as labor slugging, became common in the industry. Violence was used as a tool on both sides of the labor divide. At the same time, Jewish street gangs saw opportunity. Figures like Louis Buchalter and Jacob Shapiro moved into the garment industry under the banner of protecting unions. In reality, they became labor racketeers, using intimidation, beatings, and extortion to gain control over unions, trucking routes, and factory contracts. While they sometimes fought employer-hired thugs, they also coerced union leaders, skimmed dues, and forced both workers and bosses to pay for protection. What began as worker self-defense gradually evolved into organized crime's grip on labor. By the 1920s and 1930s, figures like Buchalter and Shapiro wielded enormous power over the garment industry, profiting from violence on all sides. Eventually, state and federal authorities moved in, and high-profile prosecutions dismantled many of these rackets. But labor racketeering itself would persist in American unions for decades to come. Shifting away from New York, let's move on to another major American city that was experiencing a great deal of rapid growth population-wise, and a great deal of industrial growth, which was Detroit. As immigrants continued to enter America in droves, Detroit had an attraction for the surplus job demand and supply needed. Detroit experienced a huge rapid growth from the 1920s to the 1930s, with the industrial needs of World War II expanding this growth even more. Like previously mentioned in New York, Detroit also had an abundant number of Jewish immigrants coming in as well. During the industrial boom from the early 1900s to the 1930s, many immigrants moved into the city in greater numbers, with neighborhoods beginning to be established among ethnic lines. As a result of this, many of the earliest Detroit gangs can be seen from these ethnic lines being formed in neighborhoods, where smaller and unorganized young youths grouped together to protect local merchants and neighborhood residents from outsiders. Over time, however, many of these gangs began to act out of self-interest and for their own business interests, both in terms of power and finance. One of these gangs, who would form during this time period, and who would control the majority of Detroit's gang world from the 1920s to the 1930s, was the Purple Gang. The Purple Gang was one of the most infamous and organized crime groups in the United States. The Purple Gang were known to protect Detroit's narcotic dealers and were also known for bootlegging, extortion, kidnapping, and murder. The Purple Gang were so intimidating that whenever Purple Gang members were brought to trial, witnesses refused to testify out of fear, and jurors were afraid to convict them. This intimidation was so bad that prosecutors were unable to convict any Purple Gang members until the 1930s. The Purple Gang had its origins with the Bernstein family. In 1902, Harry Bernstein, a young shoemaker, as well as his wife and 6 kids, arrived in Detroit. With his shoemaking skills, Harry opened his own shoe store on Gratiot Avenue in the Lower East Side of Detroit. The Bernstein kids, seeing how life was for their parents, sought out the streets in order to look for ways to financially support their parents. The oldest of the kids, Abe Bernstein, became a skilled card dealer and stickman. This gave Abe massive connections to the underground world of Detroit, as gambling was illegal at the time. Through these connections, Abe was able to meet corrupt officials, police officials, and gang members. While Abe was busy meeting and establishing connections, Abe's other brothers were busy claiming and marking turf in the streets. Their turf consisted of the Jewish ghetto that went from Jefferson Avenue to East Grand Boulevard. The outskirts from their claimed turf went for roughly 2 blocks east and west of Hastings Avenue, where many of the Purple Gang members would originally come from. As a result, between the merge of the Purple Gang and infamous Detroit mobsters, the Oakland Sugar House Gang was born. This Sugar House Gang were an extremely violent gang who helped protect Jewish liquor merchants from other rival gangs, as well as becoming heavily involved with running rackets, such as against both non-union workers and union members, who were hired by corrupt union bosses to keep them in check. After being acquitted in labor trials, the gang became known once more as the Purple Gang. This mergence between Sugar House and the Purple Gang eventually caused some major issues. The merging groups lacked a sense of common identity between its members, with the original Purple Gang members still identifying more with their original identity and peers, all while the newer members were joining under its new Sugar House alias, and these members sticking more connected to the identity of the new gang, as well as those other newer members. Though the name had eventually changed back to the Purple Gang, much of the lack of harmony built into the gang would eventually lead to its downfall, as the gang would eventually eat itself alive with too many internal turmoils and power struggles between members. By 1935, the Purple Gang was over, with over 18 members having been killed by other members by that same year. Earlier that same year, Abe Bernstein, along with several of the original members, could see the eventual downfall of the gang. As a result, Bernstein decided to hand over the Detroit rackets to the Italian mafia peacefully, as they had been continuously striving in power at the time, with the Purple Gang simultaneously losing power. Though Bernstein gave away the rackets likely for self-preservation of his life, the Italian mafia still decided to give him enough money to retire for life in exchange. The Purple Gang had certainly made their mark in the gang world, becoming one of the notorious gangs in United States history, especially within Detroit. Its success can be attributed to street smarts, heavy strong aggression, and criminal organization. Its downfall was also ironically also due to their organization, with their organization becoming disorganized over time, due to greed and mistrust. Moving away from Detroit, it is useful to examine the early 1940s. During this period, the United States had entered World War II, which became the country's primary focus and drew attention away from domestic issues like gang activity. At the same time, gang involvement declined, largely because many young, able-bodied men were drafted or enlisted to serve in the military. However, by the late 1940s and into the 1950s, gang activity began to reappear. This resurgence included significant numbers of African American, Puerto Rican, and Mexican American youth. Additionally, gang-related violence became more intense and widespread, partly due to increased access to firearms and the use of automobiles, which made mobility and conflict easier. Changes in immigration policy and patterns of internal migration during the mid-20th century also contributed to a growing focus on gang development in the western United States. Mexican migration to the United States was already well established in the early 20th century, but it increased significantly and continued to grow in later decades. In the Southwest, the expansion of Mexican and Mexican-American communities became one of several factors shaping the social conditions in which gangs later emerged. While this migration contributed to population growth in those regions, these communities often faced discrimination and social exclusion similar to that experienced by earlier immigrant groups. At the same time, internal migration within the United States played a major role in the expansion of street gangs. Large numbers of African Americans relocated from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West in search of better economic opportunities and living conditions. Despite these hopes, they encountered continued discrimination as their marginalization in American society had already been deeply rooted. Let's begin to discuss the city of Los Angeles. Before the 1940s, gangs in Los Angeles existed in earlier forms, but gangs as we understand them today, more organized, territorial, and violent, had a very limited presence. However, within a few decades, beautiful Los Angeles would soon adopt the nickname handle of street gang capital of the world. The escalation of gangs in Southern California would be the result of the two-pronged migration of millions of Mexicans from rural Mexico and large numbers of African Americans from rural America. Due to the high amount of migration coming primarily from Mexicans, we will first begin to focus on Mexican American gangs in Los Angeles first, and then discuss African American gangs in Los Angeles later on. Southern California underwent rapid economic growth during the 1920s, which produced two major outcomes. On one side, heavy promotion of California real estate attracted large numbers of white middle-class migrants from the Midwest to areas like Los Angeles and Orange County. These newcomers often brought with them strong nationalist and nativist beliefs, along with ties to movements such as the Ku Klux Klan. At the same time, this economic expansion created a high demand for labor, particularly in jobs like agriculture and domestic service. Many Mexicans migrated north to meet this demand, seeking better economic opportunities for themselves. However, most arrived with limited resources and access to education, making them especially vulnerable to discrimination and prejudice. In Los Angeles, Mexican Americans were often met with hostility and were treated in ways similar to African Americans. Because of economic hardship, they were concentrated in neighborhoods near and east of downtown. With little political influence, these communities frequently faced displacement as their neighborhoods were cleared for urban development projects, including the construction of the Civic Center in the 1920s and later Dodger Stadium in Chavez Ravine in 1951. Many of these impoverished barrios that formed during the mid-20th century have not disappeared, but continue to exist across the Southwest today. Immigrant labor from Asia and Mexico had been a central part of California's agricultural workforce since the gold rush of 1848. However, policies such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentlemen's Agreement restricted Asian immigration and reduced their presence in the labor force, which in turn increased opportunities for Mexican workers seeking employment. Mexican migration grew significantly in the early 20th century, particularly between 1900 and 1929, as many individuals came north in search of economic opportunity, especially in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. Beginning in 1942 and continuing into the mid-1960s, migration remained high, with millions of labor contracts issued to Mexican workers through the Bracero program to meet the increased demand for agricultural labor during World War II. However, by the mid-1950s, negative political attitudes toward Mexican immigrants intensified. In 1954, the U.S. government launched Operation Wetback, an effort aimed at removing undocumented Mexican migrants. These enforcement actions often extended beyond their intended targets, as many Mexican American citizens were also subjected to sudden raids in homes, workplaces, public spaces, and even churches, with such practices continuing into the 1960s. Mexican migrants who settled in Southern California carried with them a social tradition called Palomilla, which referred to groups of young men in a village who formed close-knit, age-based cohorts as part of their transition into adulthood. Within this tradition, there was a general acceptance of youthful behavior, often reflected in a boys will be boys mindset. After arriving in Southern California, these groups became tied to specific neighborhoods or parishes, commonly known as barrios, where young men were raised with the belief that defending their barrio was an important responsibility. Over time, these informal peer groups of Mexican adolescents laid the groundwork for what would later develop into modern Mexican-American gangs. James Diego Vigil, a well-known sociologist whose research focuses on gangs in Los Angeles, identified a process he described as marginalization within the Mexican-American community. His work suggests that a combination of cultural and structural factors increases the likelihood that Mexican-American youth may become involved in gangs. This marginalization can be traced back to the 19th century, following the American conquest of California, which had previously been Mexican territory. Further compounding this experience, large numbers of Mexican Americans were repatriated to Mexico during the Great Depression. Many of those deported were actually born in the United States, and upon arrival in Mexico, they were often treated as outsiders. As a result, they faced the challenge of adapting to a new environment, including learning Spanish, which had often been discouraged or prohibited in Los Angeles schools. Altogether, these historical and social conditions intensified tensions between white Americans and Mexican Americans. With this historical background in mind, it is important to consider what many view as a key turning point in the development of Mexican-American gangs in Los Angeles: the Zoot Suit Riots. Sociologist Joan Moore, who is widely recognized for her research on Mexican-American gangs, argues that the gangs emerging in the 1940s were shaped by a broader climate of social hysteria. She uses the concept of moral panic to describe the widespread attitudes toward Mexican Americans in Southern California during this time. Moral panics tend to arise in cycles and are fueled by heightened fear or public outrage, often driven by narratives from the media and law enforcement. These reactions are frequently directed at marginalized minority groups. Moore points to both the Zoot Suit riots and the gang-related case known as the Sleepy Lagoon case as pivotal moments that intensified white-dominated moral panic, ultimately contributing to the consolidation and growth of Mexican-American gangs in the region. The moral panic surrounding rising delinquency among Mexican-American youth grew exponentially on June 12, 1942, when 19-year-old Frank Torres was ambushed and fatally shot outside a track meet at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. The disorder that followed nearly escalated into a riot. In response, newspapers began publishing stories claiming that wartime juvenile delinquency among Mexican-American youth gangs was spiraling out of control. At the same time, the Los Angeles Police Department, whose resources were significantly strained due to World War II military drafts, attempted to manage the growing concerns about crime in Mexican-American neighborhoods. On July 27, 1942, tensions escalated further when a crowd resisted police efforts to break up a craps game at the intersection of Pomeroy and Mott Streets in Boyle Heights. Just days later, on August 1, 1942, a violent altercation occurred near a reservoir on the Williams Ranch, commonly referred to as the Sleepy Lagoon. This conflict involved youths from the 38th Street neighborhood, predominantly Mexican-American, and those from Downey, which was largely white at the time. The Sleepy Lagoon itself was one of two reservoirs used for irrigation in what is now Bell, California. For local youth, it served as a recreational space, functioning as a swimming spot during the day and a gathering place at night. Mexican-American youth frequently used the area, in part because they were often excluded from public recreational facilities. On the night of August 1st, several couples from the 38th Street neighborhood were parked near the reservoir when they were suddenly attacked by individuals associated with the Downey Group. After the assault, one of the victims gathered members of the 38th Street group to retaliate. However, instead of locating those responsible, they encountered a birthday party taking place on the Williams Ranch, where Jose Diaz and other immigrant families resided. Believing incorrectly that the Downey Group was present, members of the 38th Street group attacked the partygoers. During the chaos, Jose Diaz was killed, an event that quickly became known as the Sleepy Lagoon murder and received widespread media attention. In the aftermath, police launched a large-scale operation, detaining more than 600 individuals for questioning. Ultimately, authorities focused on 22 alleged members of the 38th Street Group as suspects. On October 13th, 1942, the case of People versus Zamora went to trial, involving 17 of the defendants. The remaining 5 were tried separately after their families secured independent legal representation. This case became the largest mass trial in California history at the time. On January 12th, 1943, the verdicts were delivered. 5 defendants were convicted of assault, 9 were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to terms ranging from 5 years to life, and 3 were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The 5 individuals who were tried separately were ultimately acquitted. The severity of the sentences, combined with what many viewed as insufficient evidence, led to widespread outrage within the Mexican-American community. Many questioned the fairness of the proceedings and argued that the defendants had been subjected to discrimination. On October 2nd, 1944, the Second District Court of Appeals overturned the convictions, dismissed the case, and cleared the defendants' records. Authorities chose not to pursue a retrial, leaving the death of Jose Diaz unresolved. Tensions between Mexican Americans and white Americans intensified in the aftermath of the Sleepy Lagoon case. At the same time, World War II added further strain to the city's social environment. Many white Americans were sent overseas to fight in a segregated military, while women and minorities stepped into jobs that had previously been reserved for white workers. Meanwhile, newspapers and radio broadcasts began warning the public about so-called Mexican zoot suit gangs, contributing to growing fear and suspicion. The zoot suit itself originated as a style associated with African American youth and jazz culture, but it was adopted by Mexican American youth during the 1940s. In a period marked by segregation, discrimination, and unspoken expectations that people of color remain inconspicuous in public, the zoot suit stood out. With its exaggerated features, broad shoulders, a tapered waist, baggy pants, and long coats, it challenged dominant ideas of proper appearance and behavior. Those who wore zoot suits were often labeled pachucos. African American and Mexican American youth also referred to the style as drapes or chukes, terms likely derived from the word pachuco. Because the suits required large amounts of fabric and skilled tailoring, they were considered expensive and even drew criticism from older, more conservative Mexican Americans. Hostility toward Mexican American zoot suiters was not based solely on assumptions of criminality. It was also tied to wartime conditions. During World War II, fabric was rationed, and strict limits were placed on how much material could be used for civilian clothing. Since zoot suits used an excessive amount of fabric, wearing them was often viewed as unpatriotic. As a result, police frequently carried out raids in neighborhoods where zoot suiters lived, further escalating tensions. In the aftermath of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Los Angeles viewed itself as highly susceptible to enemy attack. Civilian defense patrols were organized across the city, and beaches along the coast were reinforced with anti-aircraft weaponry. Southern California also served as a major military hub, and on many weekends, as many as 50,000 servicemen were present in Los Angeles. Many of the single servicemen on leave sought relationships with Mexican-American women. At the same time, servicemen who were married or already in relationships accused Mexican-American men of provoking or harassing their wives and girlfriends. Rumors also spread that Mexican-American youths were socializing with and dating the partners of servicemen who were away fighting in the war. This growing sense of jealousy, combined with increasing hostility toward zoot suiters, created a tense environment that ultimately erupted into violence. Anglo servicemen stationed in the city began engaging in a series of brutal confrontations with Mexican-American youth. By the spring of 1943, these clashes were occurring as frequently as 2 to 3 times per day. By May, tensions escalated further during what became known as the Venice Riot. Local high school students had complained that zoot suiters had taken over the beachfront area. On May 1st, a group of approximately 500 sailors soldiers, and civilians gathered at the Aragon Ballroom in Venice Beach and attacked Mexican-American youths as they attempted to flee the dance. On May 31st, around 50 sailors fought with Mexican-American youths near downtown Los Angeles, during which Seaman Second Class Joe Coleman was seriously injured. In response, on June 3rd, sailors from the Naval Reserve Armory sought retaliation by targeting anyone wearing a zoot suit, giving rise to what became known as the Zoot Suit Riots. During the second night of unrest, Mexican-American youths drove past the armory, shouting insults and taunts at the guards. Later that evening, when sailors were unable to locate zoot suiters in that area, they expanded their attacks into Mexican-American neighborhoods, such as East Los Angeles and Boyle Heights. Law enforcement in Los Angeles appeared largely unwilling to intervene. In some cases, their inaction seemed to worsen the situation, as officers were reported to have stood by or even encouraged the servicemen. This lack of response may have been influenced by reduced police numbers due to the military draft, as well as low wages that had remained stagnant between 1925 and 1943, potentially lowering motivation to engage. Additionally, many officers were veterans of World War I, which may have made them less inclined to arrest servicemen. Violence between the two groups intensified, with June 7th often considered the most severe day of the unrest. On that day, servicemen from San Diego traveled to Los Angeles to take part in the fighting. Roughly 5,000 individuals, both servicemen and civilians, gathered in downtown Los Angeles and engaged in attacks against Mexican Americans. In response, young men from various barrios organized counterattacks, at times drawing sailors into planned ambushes. After the violence subsided, the governor of California called for the formation of a citizens committee to investigate the causes of the riots. The committee determined that racism played a central role in the outbreak of violence. However, Los Angeles Mayor Fletcher Bowron publicly claimed that the unrest was the result of juvenile delinquency and denied that racial prejudice was a significant factor. Although most associated with Los Angeles, similar incidents occurred on a smaller scale in cities such as Detroit and New York. In these locations, white Americans also targeted Mexican American and African American youth, sometimes forcibly removing their zoot suits. Over time, the zoot suit style faded from popularity. The reservoir previously mentioned, known as Sleepy Lagoon, was eventually filled in due to expanding urban development. This broader historical context is important when examining the development of gang culture. The response of Mexican American communities to the attacks, particularly the defense of their neighborhoods against sailors and police, led many young people to admire those involved in resisting the violence, viewing them as heroic figures. One gang in particular, White Fence, came to represent Mexican American pride due to its role in confronting servicemen. White Fence continues to exist today and remains influential in several East Los Angeles neighborhoods. The gang has also expanded with affiliated groups, or sets, operating throughout Southern California and even in Las Vegas. A set refers to a subdivision or branch connected to the original gang. A large number of Mexican-American gangs in Los Angeles are concentrated in an area commonly referred to as East Los Angeles, which has one of the highest Mexican-American populations in the United States. The White Fence Gang was based in the neighborhood of Boyle Heights and got its name from a white picket fence that extended along much of its territory near the Los Angeles River. Originally, Boyle Heights was developed prior to World War I as an upscale suburb located on elevated land east of downtown Los Angeles, across the river. During the 1920s, more affordable housing became available, drawing in a diverse population that included Armenians, Jews, Russians, and Japanese residents. At the same time, Mexican immigrants arriving in Los Angeles began constructing makeshift homes in the ravines and low-lying areas of Boyle Heights. By the 1940s, Mexican Americans had become the dominant population in the area, especially after Japanese residents were forcibly removed and placed in internment camps during World War II. Despite this growth, many Mexican Americans in East Los Angeles continued to experience poverty, often living in informal housing that lacked basic services such as running water and sewage systems. Located east of Boyle Heights is a group of neighborhoods collectively known as Maravilla, an unincorporated area of Los Angeles County that many Angelenos consider part of East Los Angeles. Several gangs have historically operated in Maravilla, including one of the most well-known, El Hoyo Maravilla. Mexican settlement in the area began before the 1920s, but population growth increased significantly with the development of Belvedere Gardens. Although Los Angeles experienced major economic growth after World War II, neighborhoods like Maravilla and Boyle Heights did not benefit equally. Much of this disparity was due to limited educational opportunities and language barriers faced by Mexican Americans. At the same time, industries such as aerospace played a major role in driving the region's economic expansion. Maravilla was home to multiple gangs, many of which were named after specific streets, with territories that were relatively small in size. During the Zoot Suit riots, Maravilla was among the neighborhoods entered by servicemen, prompting local gang members to defend their community. Their resistance earned them respect within the barrio, particularly among younger boys who looked up to them for protecting the neighborhood. With the onset of World War II, many older gang members were drafted into military service, leaving a gap in local protection. Despite this, groups like White Fence and El Hoyo Maravilla continued to uphold their traditions, often becoming even more intense in their efforts to defend their neighborhoods. Both gangs remain active today, with White Fence maintaining a strong and visible presence in East Los Angeles. East Los Angeles continues to face challenges related to lower levels of educational attainment and economic opportunity. Since the 1940s, the area has also experienced limited political influence, which has contributed to major disruptions in the community. Urban development projects, particularly freeway construction in the 1950s, displaced residents and divided neighborhoods. Meanwhile, sensationalized media coverage throughout the 1950s continued to portray Mexican-American gangs in a negative light. African Americans have long experienced oppression in the United States. Even after gaining freedom from slavery, their access to legitimate opportunities within higher socioeconomic levels remained extremely limited. In search of better living conditions than those available in the rural South, many African Americans migrated to places such as Southern California. Like Mexican Americans, they largely came from rural backgrounds and brought with them strong traditions centered on family connections and church life. By the late 1920s and 1930s, African American street gangs had begun to emerge on the east side of Los Angeles, particularly around Central and Vernon Avenues. Social clubs were also established in downtown Los Angeles during this time. As the African American population grew in the late 1930s and 1940s, it gradually expanded southward from downtown along Central Avenue toward Slauson Avenue. Areas between Slauson and Manchester, which had previously been predominantly white in the 1920s and 1930s, became increasingly occupied by African American residents. Meanwhile, the community had already been expanding in Watts, especially between 92nd Street and Imperial Highway. These shifts contributed to the development of what became known as South Central, which served as the primary residential area for African Americans in Los Angeles. Among the earliest African American gangs in Los Angeles during the 1920s and 1930s were groups such as the Goodlows, the Magnificents, and the Boozies. The Boozies consisted of a network of brothers and associates who were involved in activities such as prostitution and robbery, operating mainly in the Jefferson Park area. The Magnificents were made up of youth from the Central Avenue district. While many of these early juvenile gangs faded by the late 1930s, the 1940s saw the rise of social clubs throughout African American communities, many of which later developed into gangs. Some of the more notable groups from this later period included the Purple Hearts and the 31st and 28th Street gangs. Although a few of these clubs initially aimed to function as political organizations, most served as a means of protection against white gangs. Certain groups did engage in activities such as petty theft, robbery, and assault, though homicide was relatively uncommon at the time. Weapons typically included bats, chains, knives, and in many cases, hand-to-hand fighting. During the 1950s, African Americans in Southern California formed car clubs inspired by similar clubs that were popular among white communities. Some of these included groups such as the Lowriders, Coasters, Highwaymen, and Road Devils. At the time, the Los Angeles Police Department did not classify these organizations as gangs. It was not until the Watts riots that African American youth groups began to be viewed as a significant concern. Watts, a neighborhood in Los Angeles with a predominantly African American population, was characterized by a range of social challenges, including poverty, overcrowding, high unemployment, and elevated crime rates. On August 11th, during a period of extreme heat, police stopped a young African American man on suspicion of driving under the influence. A crowd quickly formed, expressing anger toward the officers. As tensions rose, individuals began throwing bottles and other objects at the police. When additional officers arrived, they were met with even more hostility, including a barrage of stones and debris. As night fell, the unrest intensified. Some individuals began throwing Molotov cocktails at passing white motorists, while others looted stores and set buildings on fire. Thousands of National Guard troops were eventually deployed, encountering armed resistance in some areas. What began as a single incident escalated into several days of widespread violence, lasting nearly a week. By the time the unrest ended, 34 people had been killed, over 1,000 were injured, and close to 4,000 individuals had been arrested. The impact of the Watts riots extended far beyond Los Angeles, contributing to a wave of urban uprisings across the United States over the following 2 years. Their significance was profound, as they played a role for African American gangs similar to the influence that the Zoot Suit riots had on Mexican American gangs. In the aftermath, young African American men in areas like Watts were increasingly viewed negatively by broader Los Angeles communities. During this period, African American gangs in South Central Los Angeles began adopting styles and practices similar to those of Mexican American gangs. These included displaying colors, defending specific territories, using graffiti, gathering in groups, and initiating new members through established rituals. By the 1960s, these groups started forming alliances, sometimes referred to as nation gangs. One of the most well-known of these, the Crips, traces its origins back to the mid-1960s. Across the history of street gangs, it is evident that young people have often formed groups for protection in order to improve their chances of survival. This pattern can be seen in many different time periods, from youth groups in the Middle Ages to colonial America, where individuals banded together for basic safety, and later among ethnic-based gangs, such as Irish American groups in the 1800s. A large proportion of gang members historically came from disadvantaged racial and ethnic backgrounds, and their primary focus was on defending their neighborhoods and protecting members of their own communities. However, by the mid-1960s and into the early 1970s, this defensive mindset began to shift toward what more closely resembles modern gang behavior. Gangs became increasingly aggressive, expanding their territorial ambitions and becoming more mobile. Activities such as drive-by shootings emerged, and many groups became involved in the illegal drug trade, recognizing its economic potential. During the 1960s, smaller neighborhood gangs started to consolidate into larger organizations known as nation gangs. The Crips were among the first to form such alliances, while rival groups eventually united under the banner of the Bloods. In Chicago, the Vice Lords grew rapidly, expanding from just 8 original members in 1957 to approximately 8,000 by the mid-1960s. One faction, known as the Conservative Vice Lords, attempted to legitimize itself by establishing a formal business in 1967. However, both city officials, including Mayor Richard J. Daley, and rival gangs questioned the sincerity of this effort, and by 1969, the initiative had collapsed. At the same time, other major gangs in Chicago expanded, including the Latin Kings, Latin Disciples, and Gangster Disciples. These groups eventually aligned into larger coalitions known as the People and the Folks. Despite these developments, gang activity did not immediately capture widespread public attention. One reason for this lack of awareness was that the 1960s and 1970s were marked by numerous major social and political movements that dominated national focus. Events such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, and widespread anti-Vietnam War protests drew public attention away from the issue of gangs. Additionally, gang activity during this period remained largely concentrated in specific urban areas and neighborhoods, which limited broader concern. This situation changed dramatically in the 1980s, when gang activity expanded significantly. At the beginning of the decade, gang problems were primarily associated with major cities such as Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles. By the end of the 1980s, however, gangs had spread to medium-sized cities and even rural areas. Violence increased substantially during this period, partly due to greater access to firearms and the widespread use of automobiles, which allowed gangs to operate more efficiently across larger areas. The severity of gang-related issues did not decline after this period and has continued into the 21st century, remaining a significant social concern. Let's revisit the topic of Los Angeles gangs, this time focusing on their presence in the 21st century. Los Angeles and its surrounding county contain the highest concentration of street gangs in the United States, a pattern that began to emerge during the 1970s. Despite the broader economic growth of that decade, East Los Angeles continued to struggle with poverty, leading to growing frustration among young people. During this time, the African American Crips had already become a dominant force, and the formation of the Bloods followed as a direct response. Meanwhile, Mexican American gangs continued to expand, with groups like White Fence playing a leading role. Asian American gangs, including organizations such as Triads and Tongs, with historical roots stretching back centuries, also began to appear. While African American gangs often formed alliances across neighborhoods, Mexican American gangs generally did not follow this pattern. Both the number of gangs and their membership steadily increased. Although public concern about gangs had declined during the 1960s and 1970s, it resurfaced in the 1980s, particularly in Southern California. By 1980, estimates suggested there were over 30,000 gang members in Los Angeles County, and by 1982, many gangs had become heavily involved in drug distribution. The crack cocaine trade surged during the 1980s, with gangs controlling a significant portion of the market. As a result, gang-related violence and homicide became persistent issues in the region. Today, it is estimated that there are around 40,000 members of the Crips, Bloods, and 18th Street gangs combined, spread across roughly 400 sets within the city of Los Angeles alone. These groups represent only a portion of the broader gang landscape, as Southern California is believed to have approximately 2,000 gangs and about 165,000 total members. Los Angeles continues to serve as the central hub for both the Crips and Bloods, whose influence has extended to nearly every major city in the United States, as well as to several locations internationally. Chicago faces a significant gang issue, second only to Los Angeles, and since the mid-1980s, the number of gangs has grown rapidly. Levels of violence and homicide have also reached alarming levels. The city acts as a central hub for several major super gangs, most notably the People Nation and the Folks Nation. These are not single gangs, but alliances made up of multiple, smaller, well-identified groups. For instance, one of the largest gangs in Chicago, the Black Gangster Disciples, estimated at around 35,000 members, along with the Latin Disciples, are part of the Folks Nation. On the opposing side, the People Nation includes major groups such as the Latin Kings, with approximately 18,000 members, and the Vice Lords, who have an estimated 20,000 members. The Black Gangster Disciples are primarily concentrated on Chicago's South Side. The Latin Disciples are somewhat unique in that they are racially and ethnically diverse, which is less common among gangs that are typically more homogeneous. They are often found in areas like Humboldt Park and Logan Square on the northwest side. The primary rivals of the Folks Nation are the gangs aligned with the People Nation, including the Latin Kings and Vice Lords. The Latin Kings are considered one of the oldest and largest Hispanic gangs, operating across various neighborhoods, but especially prominent on the southwest side. The Vice Lords, dating back to the 1950s, originated in the North Lawndale area and are among the oldest of Chicago's major gangs. Their alliance with the Latin Kings largely developed in response to the formation and growth of the Folks Nation. Gangs in Chicago are deeply involved in illegal drug distribution and sales, which many disadvantaged youths view as a quick way to earn money. Like many cities in the North and Northeast, Chicago experienced industrial decline, leaving many young people, especially those with limited education and job skills, facing few economic opportunities. The city's education system has also been widely criticized. Sociologist Felix Padilla, known for his work The Gang as an American Enterprise, argued that Chicago's public school system ranks among the worst in the nation. Many gang members he studied described negative school experiences, including teachers who judged them harshly before giving them a fair chance. As a result, many students dropped out without completing high school, contributing to a high dropout rate. When feelings of hopelessness combine with social marginalization, the likelihood of delinquency increases. In neighborhoods struggling with poverty, limited resources, and economic instability, the conditions that encourage gang involvement and formation become increasingly apparent. New York City, the largest city in the United States, has a population that exceeds that of Los Angeles and Chicago combined. As discussed throughout this video, New York has played a major role in the historical development of street gangs. The European, white ethnic gangs that dominated in the 1800s have largely been replaced by more contemporary groups such as the Bloods, Latin Kings, Nietas, Crips, and MS-13. In addition, newer immigrant populations, particularly from Central America, have also formed their own gangs. Around 2001, New York City was estimated to have approximately 15,000 gang members, with the Bloods alone accounting for roughly 5,000 of that total. In fact, the Bloods have surpassed the Latin Kings, who were once considered the largest and most violent gang in the city. That same year, officials at Rikers Island reported that about 1,775 inmates out of a population of 15,000 were affiliated with as many as 47 different gangs. Among the most prominent were the Bloods, Latin Kings, Nietas, Five Percenters, and Crips. Gang organization in New York differs notably from that in Los Angeles. In LA, members of the Bloods often have close ties to others in nearby neighborhoods, creating more cohesive networks. In contrast, New York Bloods tend to be more loosely connected, which can result in less centralized organization. By 2004, Long Island, particularly areas in New York, was experiencing a sharp rise in gang activity, largely driven by MS-13. This Salvadoran gang aggressively challenged other established groups and also faced conflict with rival Salvadoran gangs. In October 2004, 6 MS-13 members in Nassau County were charged with the murders of 2 individuals suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. According to Nassau County Police, 6 of the 22 homicides in 2003 were gang-related, and 5 of the 18 homicides recorded between January and October 2004 were also linked to gangs. Authorities estimated that between 3,000 and 5,000 gang members were active in Nassau County alone. Both federal and local law enforcement agencies identified MS-13 as a major contributor to the rise in gang activity on Long Island. Mexican gangs were also present in the region. In Newburgh, officials accused the Bencard Barrio Kings of operating a street-level cocaine distribution network and being involved in at least 1 homicide. An 18-month investigation into this group led to the deportation of 23 Mexican nationals and the arrest of 27 others. In 2010, the Bloods were engaged in ongoing conflicts with rival groups in Harlem. Meanwhile, in Newburgh, a city in Orange County, New York, both Bloods and Latin Kings factions had been terrorizing residents for years along the Hudson River. On May 13, 2010, a large-scale pre-dawn operation involving roughly 500 federal, state, and local law enforcement officers resulted in the arrest of 60 suspected Bloods members and 18 suspected Latin Kings members. The FBI assistant director in charge of the Southern District of New York stated that the Hudson Valley Safe Streets Task Force had committed years earlier to addressing the escalating gang violence in Newburgh. Although Newburgh is a relatively small city with a population of about 29,000 and located roughly 70 miles north of Manhattan, it has experienced unusually high crime rates driven by gang activity. The Bloods and Latin Kings have been identified as the most prominent groups operating in the area. In both 2008 and 2009, Newburgh had the highest per capita violent crime rate in New York State. Over a 30-month period, 16 homicides were recorded in the city, with all but 2 or 3 linked to gang violence. For a city of its size, this resulted in a homicide rate of approximately 55.2 per 100,000 residents, nearly 10 times the national average. Among the Bloods factions active in the area were the Newburgh Bloods, Bounty Hunter Bloods, G-Shine, and Nine Trey. The Bloods primarily controlled the northeastern part of the city, while the Latin Kings dominated the southeastern section. Those arrested faced charges including racketeering, murder, assault, robbery, and drug trafficking. In 2012, federal authorities arrested Ronald Herron, leader of the Mad Dogs, a Bloods-affiliated group that had been responsible for violence in a Brooklyn neighborhood for over a decade. Herron faced multiple charges, including 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and racketeering. He had even posted a video online identifying himself as the head of a murder team. On a broader scale, although the Crips outnumber the Bloods nationwide, especially in Los Angeles, by roughly 3-1, the situation in New York City is reversed, where Blood sets are more prevalent. Crips groups have been active in areas such as South Jamaica and Far Rockaway, where they have been involved in drug distribution. In April 2010, a violent incident in Times Square left 4 people shot and led to the arrest of 56 minors during what authorities believe to be a Crips initiation event. Notably, the gathering had been organized through Twitter, highlighting the growing role of social media in gang activity. Alongside the Bloods, the Latin Kings remain one of the most influential gangs within Rikers Island. In June 2010, a Latin Kings faction was arrested for operating a large heroin distribution network in Bedford Park. In another incident, 18 members were arrested after throwing Molotov cocktails at the homes of a member's family when he attempted to leave the gang. MS-13 has gained such a reputation for violence that the FBI established a specialized task force to monitor and combat the group. The gang has maintained a presence in neighborhoods such as Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, and throughout Long Island. Another rapidly growing group in New York City is the Trinitarios, a Dominican gang that originated in Sing Sing prison during the late 1980s. Known for wearing green and often using machetes, the Trinitarios are primarily in conflict with the Latin Kings and another Dominican gang, Dominicans Don't Play. Both groups have been involved in drug trafficking, robberies, and violent assaults across the tri-state area, including New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. In Chinatown, the group known as Born to Kill has been considered one of the most dangerous gangs, consisting largely of Vietnamese members. This group has been associated with the control of counterfeit goods markets, particularly along Canal Street. Other Chinatown gangs include Ghost Shadows on Mott Street and Flying Dragons on Pell Street, which have historically been linked to lower-level extortion activities. Additionally, Albanian Boys Incorporated has emerged as a highly organized and influential group, to the extent that federal authorities have treated it similarly to a traditional organized crime syndicate. In some respects, its structure and operations have drawn comparisons to those historically associated with the Italian mafia. According to 2010 census data, Boston has a population of just over 600,000 residents. The city, which serves as the capital of Massachusetts, has historically been divided into distinct neighborhoods shaped by ethnic identity, such as the North End, East Boston, and South Boston. Boston's history of street gangs dates back to the 1830s, when Irish gangs were already active in the area. given the city's large white population and strong presence of various ethnic groups, particularly Irish Americans. It is not surprising that Irish gangs continue to exist today. Researcher Martin Jankowski found that Irish American gangs in Boston often develop from childhood friendship groups that later evolve into adult social clubs rooted in Irish American culture. Many of these groups originate in working class neighborhoods, where gang involvement can reflect a sense of pride and loyalty to one's ethnic background. One of the most well-known modern examples is the Irish mob, which has been involved in activities such as drug trafficking and protection rackets, often targeting illegal gambling operations and other underground markets. A prominent figure associated with the Irish mob was James Whitey Bulger, who became an informant for the FBI. In exchange for providing information on rival criminals, authorities allowed him to continue his own illegal operations, which later led to a major scandal involving the FBI. Before he could be arrested on racketeering charges under RICO statutes, Bulger fled and remained a fugitive for years. He was eventually captured in Santa Monica, California, where he had been living with his longtime girlfriend. Boston is also home to many of the same gangs found in New York City, including MS-13 and the Trinitarios. In 2005, articles published in outlets such as the Boston Herald and the Militant Islam Monitor raised concerns about possible connections between MS-13 and Al-Qaeda, alleging that gang members may have assisted in smuggling terrorists into the United States. However, while law enforcement agencies acknowledge MS-13 as a serious threat to local communities, the FBI has consistently denied any verified links between the gang and Al-Qaeda. The Trinitarios, a Dominican gang that originated in Sing Sing Prison and New York City, have also established a presence in Boston and nearby Rhode Island. In 2010, the FBI's Boston Division arrested a Trinitarios leader in Rhode Island on charges related to firearms and drug offenses. This operation was carried out by the Safe Streets Task Force, a collaborative effort involving the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, and various local law enforcement agencies. In addition to street gangs, outlaw motorcycle gangs are active in the greater Boston area. In 2010, federal authorities arrested 27 members of the American Outlaws Association motorcycle gang. A 12-count indictment charged them with involvement in a criminal enterprise responsible for offenses including attempted murder, kidnapping, assault, robbery, extortion, witness intimidation, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and weapons violations. According to 2010 census data, Detroit has a population of more than 700,000 residents. Among the major cities discussed in the modern era, Detroit has one of the largest African American populations, and many of the city's gangs reflect this demographic composition. Contemporary street gangs typically form for several key reasons, including racial or ethnic identity and loyalty, protection of territory, and the pursuit of economic gain. The growth in gang membership is often linked to marginalization and limited economic opportunities. In response to the social challenges facing many residents, local rapper Al Nuke launched Operation Hip Hop, a nonprofit organization aimed at encouraging students to remain in school and providing resources such as clothing and school supplies. Nuke, along with other Detroit artists including Trick Trick, Royce, the Lodge Boys, and Seven the General, also participated in the Heal Detroit rally in June 2010, a free concert intended to raise awareness about violence and promote peace in the city's neighborhoods. Detroit has a long history of gang activity, dating back nearly a century to groups such as the Purple Gang. Following World War II, the city experienced an economic boom driven by the automobile industry, which provided jobs for many unskilled workers, often from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. However, beginning in the early 1970s, Detroit entered a period of economic decline as the auto industry downsized, a trend that also affected other Michigan cities like Flint and Saginaw. During this time, many delinquent groups began to adopt more defined gang identities, including names and organizational structures. By the mid-1970s, loosely organized groups had evolved into more structured and coordinated gangs. The rise in gang activity during the 1970s and 1980s has also been linked to the heroin epidemic that affected the city during that period. Drug distribution continues to play a central role in gang activity in Detroit today. Additionally, the large number of abandoned homes and buildings throughout the city provides space for gang operations and concealment. Detroit is home to a wide range of gangs, including nationally affiliated groups as well as regional and local organizations. The city's history of violence has contributed to its reputation as Murder City. One particularly violent group, known as Best Friends, gained national attention after being featured on a History Channel program in 2009. Federal authorities have suggested that this group exerted control over portions of the I-75 corridor, which has been described as a key route for drug trafficking into Detroit from cities such as Miami. In response to gang activity, Detroit law enforcement has worked in coordination with federal agencies. In June 2009, more than 36 individuals associated with multiple gangs, including the Latin Counts, the Folks, the Sureños, and the Jamaican Posse, were arrested as part of a broader effort to reduce gang-related crime in the city. The final city to be examined is Miami. Like Los Angeles, Miami is known for its combination of relaxed coastal living and areas affected by significant crime, where drug activity and violence have been ongoing concerns. For decades, Miami has served as a major distribution hub for illegal drugs. Similar to trends seen in other U.S. cities, control of the drug trade has increasingly shifted away from large organized cartels and towards smaller street-level gangs. According to 2010 census data, Miami has a population of over 400,000 residents. As in many large cities, a variety of nationally affiliated gangs operate in the area. Among the groups that have drawn particular attention from law enforcement are Crazy Locos and Making Life Crazy. Crazy Locos is a gang primarily made up of juveniles and young adult males, with an estimated membership of around 40 individuals between 2007 and 2009. In 2010, Manuel Medina, a member of Crazy Locos, was sentenced to life in prison after being convicted of 2 murders, as well as robbery and firearms offenses. His conviction followed an extensive investigation involving the FBI and multiple law enforcement agencies. Crazy Locos has been known to work closely with the Making Life Crazy gang. Members generate income through the sale of both prescription drugs, such as oxycodone, Xanax, and methadone, and illegal substances including marijuana, cocaine, and crack cocaine. Members are reportedly required to pay weekly dues to the gang, functioning as a form of membership or operational fee, which often leads individuals to engage in criminal activities to meet those obligations. According to the FBI, Crazy Locos operates as a criminal organization involved in a range of offenses, including attempted murder, homicide, firearms trafficking, drive-by shootings, extortion, and drug distribution. Another group of note is the Miami Gardens gang, which has been associated with drug trafficking, violent crime, intimidation, conspiracy, and identity theft. In 2011, 8 members of this group were convicted on charges related to narcotics, firearms, and identity theft. Additionally, Zoe Pound, a gang with roots in the Haitian community, operates out of Miami and has been linked to activities such as drug trafficking and robbery. In response to ongoing criminal activity and the growing influence of street gangs in Miami-Dade County, law enforcement agencies have established a number of task forces aimed at reducing gang-related crime. Well, I think it's safe to say we've gone over quite a lot of information, so let's try to summarize the gist of what we've learned here today. Organized groups resembling gangs have existed in various forms for centuries, with records tracing them back hundreds of years. Street gangs, in the modern sense, however, have a more recent origin. One of the earliest known examples, the 40 Thieves, emerged in New York City's Five Points neighborhood during the 1820s. This group, rooted largely in the Irish immigrant community, developed in response to the discrimination and marginalization Irish Americans faced as one of the first widely recognized ethnic minority groups in the United States. This pattern, where gangs are often composed of individuals from racial or ethnic groups experiencing exclusion from mainstream society, has continued over time. During the 19th century, New York City remained the central hub of gang activity. As the century progressed, gangs began to appear in other parts of the Northeast, including cities like Boston and Philadelphia, as well as in southern cities such as New Orleans, Baltimore, and Richmond. By the early 20th century, gang activity had spread to growing urban centers like Detroit and Chicago. In the mid 20th century, Los Angeles and Southern California saw a major expansion of street gangs. The emergence of groups such as the Crips, followed by the formation of the Bloods, contributed to the development of broader gang networks that would eventually spread across the country. Similarly, Chicago saw the rise of large alliances such as the People Nation and Folks Nation. By the beginning of the 21st century, these loosely connected networks had established a presence in cities nationwide. By the end of the 20th century, gangs had expanded into nearly every region of the United States. Today, they can be found not only in major metropolitan areas, but also in smaller cities, suburban communities, and even some rural regions. Over time, many gangs have become more involved in organized criminal activity, particularly drug distribution, and in some cases have grown more violent. Rather than being a temporary phenomenon, street gangs have become deeply embedded in the social fabric of American society, representing a long-standing and evolving issue that continues to shape communities across the country. Before ending off this video, I would like to credit the source material used for the information behind this video, which was the book American Street Gangs, the second edition, by Tim Delaney. If you would like to go deeper into everything we covered in this video, I've linked the exact book in the description below, which not only goes over the topics we've discussed in this video, but so much more information about American street gangs, such as theoretical explanations of street gangs, socioeconomic explanations of street gangs, gang structures and their processes of operations, female gangs, street gang intervention and suppression methods, and so much more. Use my affiliate link in the description below to check out the book if you're interested, as well as helping to support the channel. With all of that being said, thank you so much for watching.